I remember the taste of the morning's corpse starch ration, how it dissolved on my tongue like communion ash, gritty and faintly sweet with whatever binding agents they'd used that week. The flavor lingered as I descended through Sub-Level 47's personnel shaft, clinging to my teeth, mixing with the recycled air that always carried the faint copper tang of the ventilation system's antiquated filtration glands. 23 years I'd worked for the Munitorum's Tithe Assessment and Redistribution Bureau, and I'd learned that taste was the most honest sense in a hive. You could close your eyes against the poverty, plug your ears against the screaming, but taste always found you, always told you what you were really consuming. The shift began at 0600, as it had every day since my 16th natal anniversary, when I'd tested into the administrative castes. My father had wept with relief when the results came through, genuine tears cutting tracks through the industrial grime that never quite washed away from his face. He'd spent 40 years in the Promethium refineries on Sub-Level 89, and the fact that his son would work with his mind rather than his hands, would die of desk atrophy rather than chemical exposure, represented a kind of salvation in his eyes. I'd believed that once, believed in the sanctity of my position, the honor of serving the God Emperor's bureaucratic machinery. I'd believed in many things. The cogitator banks hummed their morning devotionals as I passed through the security arch, the machine spirits greeting me with their usual chorus of whirs and clicks. My supervisor, Prefect Chalice, was already at his standing desk, his augmetic left eye glowing a faint amber as it passed the morning's priority dispatches. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my existence beyond the automatic recording of my presence by the chronometer servitor that crouched in the corner, its human components long since reduced to little more than biological timekeeping mechanisms. The thing's original face was still visible beneath the metal plating, frozen in an expression I'd spent years trying to interpret: pain, ecstasy, or the simple absence of either. My station was number 47J, a desk no different from the 963 others that filled the assessment floor, each one occupied by a functionary identical to me in all the ways that mattered. We wore the same beige robes, ate the same rations, processed the same endless stream of data slates that fed into the Munitorum's vast digestive system. The Emperor required precise accounting of his resources, and we were the intestinal lining through which those resources passed, breaking down the raw matter of the Imperium into absorbable information. The first slate of the day detailed ammunition expenditure for Guard Regiment 47 Zeta, currently deployed against a greenskin incursion in the Ghoul Stars. I remember how my fingers moved across the input keys with practiced efficiency, logging each bolt shell, each last pack, each plasma coil consumed in the Emperor's name. The numbers were astronomical, as they always were, but numbers were just numbers, abstract, distant, clean. I didn't think about the men who'd fired those rounds, didn't imagine the last burns or the improvised field graves or the screaming. That wasn't my function. My function was to ensure the numbers balanced, to account for every gram of propellant, every joule of energy expended. The taste in my mouth had changed by then, grown more metallic, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the recycled water I'd sipped from my desk dispenser, or perhaps it was something else, something my body was trying to tell me that my mind refused to hear. I processed 17 more slates before the first irregularity appeared. A minor discrepancy in the casualty to munition ratio for Squad 47 Zeta 12. The numbers suggested they'd expended 47% more ammunition than should have been necessary for the confirmed enemy kills, which could indicate either wildly inaccurate fire discipline or a failure to properly record Xenos casualties in the field. Standard protocol required filing an inquiry form, 77B, and elevating the discrepancy to senior assessment for review. I reached for the appropriate form slate, my movements automatic, my mind already formulating the required justification text. But something made me pause, some instinct I couldn't name. I pulled up the squad's personnel roster instead, which was technically outside my purview but not explicitly prohibited. The names scrolled past my vision, 47 individuals reduced to serial numbers and genetic classifications. 47 names that had existed 6 weeks prior when the regiment had shipped out. Current active roster, 0. The entire squad had been killed in action, 100% casualties. The ammunition hadn't been excessive, they'd simply fought until they'd all died, burning through their allotment in a desperate last stand that had probably lasted hours, maybe days. Someone had logged their munitions expenditure with meticulous care even as the orcs closed in, had made sure the Emperor's accounting remained pure even in death. And now I was going to file an inquiry questioning their fire discipline, questioning whether they'd wasted the Emperor's resources in the act of dying for him. I filed the inquiry. Of course I filed the inquiry. That was my function, my purpose, the thing that justified my existence and kept me in clean air and corpse starch rations instead of down in the refineries breathing promethium fumes. The taste in my mouth was worse now, coating my tongue and the roof of my mouth, making me want to spit, but spitting would have been noticed, recorded, perhaps noted as a sign of questionable dedication. So I swallowed instead, and the taste went down my throat like molten copper, and I moved to the next slate. By 0900 I'd processed 63 slates. By noon I'd cleared 147. The taste never faded, never lessened, only grew stronger and more complex, developing undertones. I couldn't identify ash and oil and something organic, something that reminded me of the Medicaid facilities where they took workers who'd been exposed to mutagens, where the screaming never quite stopped even though the walls were supposed to be soundproof. I drank more recycled water. I ate my midday ration bar, which dissolved on my tongue the same way the morning's corpse starch had, gritty and inadequate, and tinged with that same creeping metallic sweetness. The afternoon brought a new class of slates, these ones dealing with civilian tithe assessments. Sub-level 92 had failed to meet its monthly grain quota by 4%, which necessitated a corresponding adjustment to their water allocation as incentive for improved performance. I input the numbers, watching them cascade through the cogitator's logic engines, calculating the precise reduction that would cause sufficient suffering to motivate better production without actually triggering widespread mortality. The algorithms were elegant, beautiful even, refined across 10,000 years of imperial governance. 47 families would lose access to their supplementary water rations. Some of them would get sick. A few might die. The very old or very young. The margins that the system was designed to shed. I approved the adjustment. My fingers moved across the keys with the same practiced efficiency they'd demonstrated all morning, all day, all 23 years. The taste in my mouth had spread now, coating my throat, seeming to seep into my sinuses so that I could smell it with every breath. That copper-ash oil fusion that I was beginning to recognize as the flavor of the Imperium itself, the taste of 10,000 years of humanity grinding itself into paste to feed the God Emperor's endless wars. The woman at Station 47K, 3 desks to my left, stood up abruptly at 1417. I remember the exact time because the chronometer servitor logged it with its usual mechanical precision, its dead eyes tracking her movement with interest that might have been human once. She didn't say anything, didn't scream or weep or curse the Emperor's name. She simply walked to the edge of the assessment floor, where the safety railing separated our level from the 70-meter drop to the sub-administrative processing chambers below, and she stepped over it with the same casual efficiency she'd brought to her data slate processing. The sound she made hitting the ferrocrete was like a sack of grain splitting open, wet and final and utterly insignificant. Prefect Chalice noted the incident in his log without looking up from his own work, triggered the servitor retrieval team with a casual gesture of his augmetic hand, and continued processing his priority dispatches. The rest of us kept working. What else were we going to do? The slates didn't stop coming just because someone had decided they couldn't continue, and falling behind on quota would mean mandatory overtime, unpaid, which would mean less sleep, which would mean more mistakes, which would mean disciplinary review. I processed another slate. This one detailed ammunition production targets for Forge Complex Theta 9, 3 levels below the refinery where my father had worked, where he still worked, where he'd die when his lungs finally gave out from promethium exposure. The numbers swam in my vision for a moment, and I realized I was crying, though I couldn't have said why. Tears were leaking from my eyes and running down my cheeks and dripping onto my desk console, and the taste in my mouth was so strong now that I was breathing it, swimming in it, drowning in it even though my lungs still pulled in air. The tiers were against regulations. Emotional displays could indicate ideological contamination, could suggest weakness that might spread to other functionaries, could justify investigation by the local Arbeits, or worse, by the Inquisition, if they happened to be operating in sector. I wiped them away as discreetly as possible. But Prefect Chalice's augmetic eye had already swiveled toward me, its lens focusing with a soft mechanical whir that I felt more than heard. He watched me for exactly 7 seconds. I counted them, each one stretching like a lifetime, and then he looked away, returning to his own work as though nothing had happened. Perhaps nothing had happened. Perhaps I was being paranoid, seeing threats where only bureaucratic indifference existed. Perhaps the taste in my mouth was just the taste of too much recycled water on an empty stomach, the flavor of poor nutrition and stress, and the natural anxiety of a man watching his colleagues' remains being scraped off the sub-administrative ferrocrete by servitors who'd once been men like me, functionaries who'd made too many mistakes, or expressed too much doubt, or simply been in the wrong place when the Munitorum needed fresh components for their biological machines. The next slate detailed ration reductions for sublevel 103, where a minor riot had broken out following the previous month's protein allocation cuts. The administratum solution was elegant in its simplicity: further reduce rations until compliance was restored, or the troublemakers died of malnutrition, whichever came first. The logic was impeccable. Resources were finite. Loyalty was mandatory, and dissent could not be tolerated when the Imperium faced extinction on every front. I input the numbers, watching the algorithms calculate death by starvation with mathematical precision, and the taste in my mouth bloomed into something new, something that made me gag even though nothing came up, just dry heaves that I disguised as coughing. No one looked at me. No one cared. I was Station 47J, a serial number in beige robes, identical to 963 other serial numbers, doing identical work in identical stations throughout the assessment floor. My individuality was a sin against efficiency, my emotions were a weakness that the Imperium couldn't afford, and my revulsion at the work I was doing was a betrayal of the God Emperor who demanded absolute service from his servants. I processed another slate, and another, and another. The numbers flowed through my station like blood through veins, like promethium through pipes, like souls through the warp. Each slate represented thousands of lives, millions of lives, entire populations reduced to data points and resource allocations. A regiment here, a hive sector there, a mining colony, a agri-world, a penal battalion, a pilgrimage fleet, all of them measured and assessed and calculated with the same cold precision that a butcher brings to carving meat. At 1630, my console chimed to indicate a priority dispatch from senior assessment. I remember how my stomach clenched when I saw the amber priority indicator, how the taste in my mouth suddenly spiked into something almost unbearable, caustic and thick and wrong. Priority dispatches were rare, usually indicating either commendation for exceptional efficiency or notification of disciplinary review. I hadn't been particularly efficient lately, hadn't exceeded my quota by more than the standard 6% buffer that was expected of all functionaries. The dispatch opened with the standard Imperial Aquila seal, wings spread across my screen, and beneath it the text scrolled with liturgical formality. I was being promoted. Effective immediately, I would be elevated to Junior Assessor 3rd Class, with all attendant privileges and responsibilities. My processing quota would double, but so would my ration allocation. I would be issued new robes, dark gray instead of beige, marking my ascension within the administrative hierarchy. I would have my own office, a space of 2 meters by 3 meters, instead of a cubicle desk on the assessment floor. I would be permitted to requisition an augmetic of my choice, pending approval, to improve my processing efficiency. I read the dispatch 3 times, my vision blurring, the taste in my mouth now so overwhelming that I couldn't separate it from my own saliva, couldn't tell where my body ended and the flavor began. This was everything my father had hoped for me, everything I'd worked toward for 23 years. This was success within the Imperium's machinery, proof that I'd pleased the God Emperor through diligent service, that I'd earned the right to serve him more completely. The dispatch continued, outlining my new responsibilities. I would be assessing not individual requisitions, but entire subsector resource allocations, making decisions that affected not thousands but millions of lives. I would determine which hive cities received grain shipments and which would be left to experience motivational scarcity. I would calculate acceptable casualty rates for guard regiments facing Xenos incursions, deciding how many men could be spent to achieve military objectives. I would be responsible for tithe collection efficiency across 47 industrial complexes, ensuring that production quotas were met, regardless of worker mortality or environmental contamination. I would become the machine I'd been feeding for 23 years. I would be the algorithm made flesh, the inhuman calculus given human hands to input the numbers that would kill and starve and brutalize in the Emperor's name. And it would be promotion. It would be honor. It would be everything I was supposed to want. The woman from Station 47K had understood something I was only beginning to grasp. The drop wasn't escape. Escape didn't exist within a hive city, within the Imperium, within the galaxy that the God Emperor's rotting corpse presided over from his golden throne. But the drop was at least a choice, at least a moment of agency before the ferrocrete removed all possibility of future complicity. She'd chosen to end rather than ascend, to fall rather than rise, and in that moment of terminal velocity, she'd been freer than anyone else on the assessment floor. I hit the acceptance key on my console. The action was automatic, instinctive, the product of 23 years of conditioning and a lifetime of imperial indoctrination. Of course I accepted. What else was there to do? Refuse and face disciplinary review, possible execution, certain demotion at best, or worse, much worse. Accept the woman's choice and take that step over the railing, feel the air rushing past, experience those few seconds of weightlessness before the inevitable impact. The taste in my mouth crystallized into something I could finally identify. It was fear, pure and undiluted. The kind of existential terror that comes from recognizing your own powerlessness. Not fear of death, which would have been clean and comprehensible, but fear of life, fear of decades more of this, of processing slates and calculating deaths, and becoming more efficient at the systematic dehumanization that kept the Imperium functioning. Fear of what I would become, what I was already becoming, what I'd been becoming since my 16th natal anniversary, when I'd first learned the taste of corpse starch and thought it tasted like salvation. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of data slates and input sequences. I processed another 97 requisitions before the shift-end bell tolled at 1800, each one leaving residue on my tongue like ash, like oil, like the copper-sweet taste of blood. The other functionaries filed out in orderly rows, their movements synchronized by years of routine, their faces blank with the exhaustion that came from spending another day feeding the God Emperor's insatiable hunger for information and control. I remained at my station after the floor cleared. Prefect Chalice had left at 1805, his augmetic eye dimming as it powered down for his rest cycle, and the chronometer servitor had entered its maintenance phase, its dead eyes staring at nothing, while its biological components received their daily nutrient infusion through tubes that disappeared into its torso. I was alone with 964 empty stations and the soft humming of cogitator banks that never slept, never rested, never stopped their endless processing of the Imperium's data. The railing where the woman had jumped was only 20 meters away. I could walk to it in 30 seconds, climb over it in 5 more, be dead in approximately 3 seconds after that, accounting for the 70-meter drop and standard gravitational acceleration. The math was simple, elegant, final. But I didn't stand up. I didn't walk to the railing. I sat at Station 47J and stared at my console and tasted copper ash oil fear on my tongue and thought about my father weeping with relief when I'd tested into the administrative castes, thought about how proud he'd be when I told him about my promotion, how he'd see it as justification for every lung-destroying shift he'd worked in the refineries. The promotion included an augmetic allowance. I could request ocular enhancement like Prefect Chalice, improve my processing efficiency, see more data more clearly, or I could request something else, something more extensive neural implants that would improve my cognitive processing, that would make the numbers flow more smoothly, that would help me think more like a machine and less like a man. Many senior assessors chose neural augmentation. It improved performance, reduced emotional interference, made the work easier by making the worker less human. I thought about that as I sat in the empty assessment floor, thought about choosing to have parts of my brain replaced with cogitator circuits, about surrendering more of myself to become better at the work that was already destroying what remained of my humanity. The Mechanicus priests who performed such procedures always described it as holy work, as bringing man closer to the machine god's perfection, but I knew what it really was. It was just another form of death, slower than the drop, but no less final, a piece-by-piece dissolution of self, until what remained was more servitor than man. The taste in my mouth would never fade, I realized. It would be there tomorrow, when I reported to my new office, would be there when I processed my first subsector allocation, would be there when I calculated how many people could starve before it affected industrial production. It would grow stronger with each decision, each input sequence, each moment of complicity. Eventually I wouldn't taste it anymore, not because it had faded, but because I'd become it, because my body would be the taste. Copper and ash and oil, the flavor of the Imperium's machinery grinding human lives into paste. Or perhaps I'd request neural augmentation, and the taste would disappear along with my capacity to feel revulsion at my work. Perhaps that was mercy. In its way, the Mechanicus removing my ability to suffer my complicity, making me more efficient by making me less capable of moral disgust. My father would be proud either way, proud that his son had risen, proud that I'd become important enough to warrant augmentation, proud that I served the God Emperor with ever-increasing efficiency. I stood up finally, at 1947 by the chronometer servitor's dead-eyed accounting. My legs were cramped from sitting too long, my back aching from the posture that all functionaries developed after years at their stations. I walked toward the exit, passing the railing where the woman had jumped, and I didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't let myself think about how easy it would be to just step over and let gravity do the rest. The descent through Sub-Level 47's personnel shaft was exactly like the morning's ascent, just reversed, the same recycled air and flickering lights and distant sounds of the Hive City's machinery digesting another day of human effort. I passed workers from the lower sub-levels, their faces marked with the grime and scars of manual labor, and I saw how they looked at my beige robes with a mixture of envy and contempt. To them I was privileged, clean, safe from the immediate physical dangers that defined their existence. They didn't understand that we were all being consumed by the same machinery, just at different rates and through different mechanisms. My father was still at work when I reached our habitation unit on Sub-Level 76. He wouldn't return until 2200, wouldn't hear about my promotion until tomorrow, and I was grateful for the delay, grateful for a few more hours before I had to watch pride bloom in his promethium-scarred face, before I had to pretend that this was triumph rather than deeper enslavement. The unit was 30 square meters of ferrocrete and recycled air, 3 rooms that housed 5 people, my father, my mother, my 2 younger sisters, and me. By Hive City standards it was spacious, a privilege of my father's 40 years of refinery work and my own administrative position. My mother had left my evening ration on the food dispenser, another bar of corpse starch, and a cup of recycled water. I looked at it for a long time before I ate, watching how the bar's surface seemed to shimmer in the habitation unit's dim lighting, seeing patterns in the compressed biomass that might have been grain or fungus or something else, something I didn't want to know about. The taste, when I finally bit into it, was exactly what I expected. Gritty, faintly sweet, tinged with copper and ash and oil and fear. I would eat this ration. Tomorrow I would wake at 0500, perform my ablutions, descend to Sub-Level 47, and report to my new office. I would process my first subsector allocation with the efficiency that had earned my promotion, would make decisions that killed people with the same cold mathematics I'd applied to ammunition requisitions and water distributions. I would request neural augmentation to improve my performance, would watch as the Mechanicus priests opened my skull and inserted their circuits, would feel my capacity for horror slowly drain away as the cogitator components integrated with my brain. Or perhaps I wouldn't. Perhaps tomorrow, or next week, or next month, I would walk to that railing and make the same choice the woman from Station 47K had made. Perhaps I would find that moment of agency, that instant of terminal velocity, before the ferrocrete ended all further complicity. But I didn't think so. I didn't think I was brave enough or broken enough or whatever it took to step over that railing and into the empty air. I was just a functionary, a serial number in beige robes, soon to be dark grey robes, eventually to be augmented and more machine than man. I would serve the God Emperor with increasing efficiency until my body failed, or my mind finally shattered, or I died at my station, processing slates to the last moment, ensuring that the numbers balanced even as I bled out from some stress-induced organ failure. That was my future, my destiny, my reward for 23 years of faithful service. The taste in my mouth would never fade because the taste was the Imperium itself, was the flavor of 10,000 years of human suffering compressed into every breath, every swallow, every moment of continued existence. You couldn't escape it by dying any more than you could escape it by living. It was the water you swam in, the air you breathed, the substance of reality within the God Emperor's domain. The woman from Station 47K had tasted it too, had felt it coating her tongue and throat and lungs until she couldn't breathe anymore, until the only response that made sense was to step over the railing and embrace the fall. I finished my ration bar and drank my water and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow I would ascend. Tomorrow I would become more than I was, which meant becoming less human, less capable of rejecting what I was doing, less able to taste the copper ash oil flavor of complicity and horror. Tomorrow I would take the first step toward becoming a machine myself, towards surrendering the capacity for moral revulsion that was currently destroying me from the inside, and my father would be proud. The God Emperor would be pleased. The Imperium would continue grinding human lives into paste with ever-increasing efficiency, and I would help, would become better at helping, would lose the parts of myself that objected to helping, until nothing remained but the function itself, pure and untainted by humanity. The taste in my mouth was so strong now that I could barely breathe, could barely think, could barely exist without drowning in it. But I would breathe anyway. I would think anyway. I would exist anyway. That was what the Imperium demanded of its servants, not willing sacrifice, but reluctant continuation, not glorious martyrdom but grinding persistence, not death but something worse than death, the slow dissolution of self across decades of service. I lay in my sleeping niche, and stared at the ferrocrete ceiling, 7 feet above my face, and tasted copper and ash, and oil and fear, and knew that tomorrow I would wake and dress, and descend and serve. Knew that I would continue serving until something inside me broke beyond repair, or I became sufficiently augmented that breaking was no longer possible. Knew that this was the only victory the Imperium offered its faithful servants, the privilege of being consumed more slowly, more completely, with greater efficiency. The Hive City hummed around me, 9 billion human beings packed into a ferrocrete mountain, each one serving in their own way, each one being consumed by the same machinery that I served, and that served the God Emperor, and that had been serving him for 10,000 years of endless war and suffering and death. We were all functionaries in that machinery, from the refuse sifters in the Underhive to the planetary governor in his spire palace, all of us processing and being processed, consuming and being consumed. My father would return in 3 hours. He would go to his sleeping niche, with promethium fumes still clinging to his lungs, would cough the refinery's poison into the recycled air, would sleep for 6 hours before waking to descend again to sub-level 89 and breathe more poison for the Emperor's glory. In the morning I would tell him about my promotion, would watch his face transform with pride and relief and joy, would accept his congratulations knowing that what he saw as triumph I experienced as damnation. But I would accept it anyway, would smile and thank him, and go to my new office and begin my new duties with all the efficiency I could muster, would request augmentation and surrender more of myself to the machine, would process subsector allocations and calculate acceptable mortality rates and condemn millions to death with the same casual precision I'd once applied to ammunition requisitions, would become what the Imperium needed me to become, what it had been shaping me to become since my 16th natal anniversary when I'd first learned the taste of corpse starch and thought it tasted like salvation. The woman from Station 47K had been wrong, I realized. Or perhaps she'd been right, but in a way I couldn't yet understand. The drop wasn't escape because escape didn't exist, but the drop was at least honest, at least authentic, at least a moment of genuine choice in a life otherwise devoid of agency. She'd chosen to end her complicity by ending herself, had refused to ascend any further into the machinery that was consuming her. I would make the opposite choice, would ascend, would be consumed, would lose myself piece by piece, until nothing remained but efficient function. Would taste copper and ash and oil and fear until I couldn't taste anything anymore, until the augmentation or the years or the sheer accumulation of horror finally destroyed whatever remained of my capacity for revulsion. And that was my fate, my destiny, my purpose, within the God Emperor's Imperium. Not to die gloriously in battle against Xenos filth or heretical traitors, but to die slowly behind a desk, processing data slates until my heart stopped, or my brain hemorrhaged, or I finally worked up the courage to take that woman's path over the railing and into the empty air, to serve with increasing efficiency even as I died inside, even as every decision I made added to the weight of guilt that was already crushing me, even as the taste in my mouth grew stronger and more unbearable with each passing day. The God Emperor required this of me. The Imperium demanded this of me. My father had sacrificed his lungs so that I could have this privilege, this honor, this slow destruction through administrative service rather than quick death in the refineries. How could I refuse? How could I reject what so many would consider blessing? I couldn't. I wouldn't. Tomorrow I would wake and serve. The next day I would wake and serve. The day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, each one identical to the last. Each one grinding me a little thinner, wearing me a little smoother, making me a little more machine and a little less man, until eventually there would be nothing left to wear away, nothing left that could object or suffer or taste copper ash oil fear with every breath. That was the Imperium's gift to its faithful servants, not death, but transformation, not ending but endless continuation, not peace but eternal service. And I would accept that gift because I had no choice, because choice itself was an illusion in a galaxy where humanity's only option was to grind itself to dust in service of a corpse god who might or might not still be aware of the suffering offered up in his name. The taste in my mouth would never fade, but someday, perhaps, I would stop noticing it. Someday the augmentation or the years or the sheer weight of accumulated horror would crush whatever remained of my capacity to taste anything at all. And that would be mercy, in its way, the Imperium's final gift to those who served long enough and faithfully enough, not reward but numbness, not salvation but cessation of feeling. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep that wouldn't come, tasting copper and ash and oil and fear, knowing that tomorrow I would wake and descend and serve, knowing that I would continue waking and descending and serving until nothing remained but the service itself, pure and empty and eternal. This was the life my father had wept to secure for me. This was the honor I'd earned through 23 years of faithful service. This was my future, my fate, my purpose. This was one day as a Munitorum Clerk on a Hive World. Tomorrow would be another day, identical to this one, except that I would have a new title and new responsibilities and a new office with slightly more space. And the day after that would be another day after that, and so on, until the days blurred together into one continuous moment of service and horror and the slow erosion of everything that had once made me human. The God Emperor protects, the priests always said, but he didn't protect us from this, didn't shield us from the grinding machinery of his own Imperium, didn't spare us from becoming the very mechanisms that consumed us. He demanded our service and our suffering and our slow dissolution into his vast bureaucratic machinery, and we gave it willingly, gratefully, faithfully, because what else was there to give? I tasted copper and ash and oil and fear, and I knew that this taste would be my companion for however many years remained before I died at my station, or stepped over the railing, or finally achieved sufficient augmentation to stop tasting anything at all. And I accepted it, accepted my fate, accepted my future, accepted the slow death that masqueraded as promotion and honor and service to the God Emperor, because I was a functionary, a serial number in beige robes soon to be dark gray, a human being in the process of becoming a machine, a servant of an empire that devoured its servants and called that devouring holy, and that was enough. That would have to be enough. That was all the Imperium offered, and so that was all I could accept. The Hive City hummed its eternal song around me, and I lay in my sleeping niche and tasted the Imperium's flavor on my tongue, and I waited for tomorrow to come so I could wake and descend and serve again, forever and ever, until the end.